Get connected. You're listening to Get Connected. Thanks for joining us. In this series, we discuss the various issues shaping your industry, how the changes in supplier ecosystems impact the way you work on a daily basis, how your customers consume the services you create, and how the industry as a whole steps up to the demands of the digital marketplace. Let's get connected.
Hello, listener. Let's get connected. My name is Chris Lewis. By day, I'm an independent industry analyst. By night, as you should know by now, I'm a podcaster. Welcome to Get Connected, where we delve into the issues shaping the networking industry and the experiences we all benefit from by being better connected. In this episode, we're talking about power cloud automation, how to bring powerful automation to your edge, telco and IT data center clouds to enable simplified, value-driven operations. In the hot seat alongside me today is the Senior Director of Product Management from Juniper's Cloud-Ready Data Center Group, Mr. James Kelly. Welcome, James. Tell us a bit about your role.
Great to be here, Chris. So I've been at Juniper for a long time, 15 years now, and all kinds of different roles. And as you said, I'm currently in the Cloud and Data Center business group. But when I started off my journey back in 2006, I started off much more technically focused as a developer advocate. I went through roles as various specialists focused on cloud and DevOps, kind of growing from an engineer to do more business development. I worked on such things as the Contrail acquisition, and more recently worked on the Apstra acquisition. But through all that time, I've spent time in the marketing teams, and it's been a long but very exciting journey of lots of different positions and lots of different exciting technology. Right, things are always changing in technology. That's one of the reasons why I love working in this field, and that's certainly true of cloud and automation today.
And it's great, isn't it? Because the issue of all these topics coming together, we often talk about now the collision of technologies coming from the data center, the enterprise and the service provider. You know, having had that experience in all those different, if you like, more basic engineering levels and then marketing, and having a taste of all the different areas really helps you shape your thinking of bringing what is a very diverse set of services and technologies to bear in this emerging cloud environment.
Yes, hopefully that's the case.
So, James, cloud has evolved from a DC technology through network and infrastructure service. How are your service providers deploying cloud today?
Yeah, so in terms of Juniper's cloud business, we sell to cloud providers, we sell to enterprises, and we sell to these network and communications service providers. We just call them service providers most of the time for short, but your cable cos, your telcos. Of course, over time, we know that data centers have, trended from more centralized to more distributed. Of course, today, the level of automation in data centers has skyrocketed. Things like moving from virtualized to containerized. I guess there's a confluence of the application teams and the operations teams underneath it. And in the operations teams, among the infrastructure silos, those things kind of coming together. They can be orchestrated together. And in the context of our service provider customers that you asked about, the biggest thing that's happening insofar as the data center space for SPs today is 5G is driving a lot of modernization of their telco cloud initiatives. And of course, these telco clouds are also distributed all the way out to the radio networks, frankly.
I think, as you rightly point out there, your customers are moving from cloud to multi-cloud to virtualized, into the worlds of containers and Kubernetes. How do you contrast what's happening with your enterprise customers? Because Juniper doesn't just cover the SP, as you said, it covers the enterprise side, it covers the data center and so on. How do you contrast what's happening with the enterprises and the service providers, where that transition within the service provider in particular is certainly perceived to be more slowly developing than in the enterprise market?
So the thing that I mentioned, I guess, like virtualized to containerized, we've seen that evolution happen more quickly in the enterprise space. So that transition is absolutely being driven by 5G. But if you go back, it's already 7 years now that we've got these open source projects like Kubernetes that are really dramatically changing the way applications run in data centers. And let's, admit for a second that the name of the game and the whole purpose of data centers is to run applications, right? Enterprises have all different kinds of applications, but primarily they're endpoint, like server type of applications, and those have been refactored into containers and into different microservices, of course. And the systems like Kubernetes and its rise and prevalence have facilitated all of that. And along with that, there's various, infrastructure changes, software-defined infrastructure changes underneath Kubernetes that support it, as well as operational changes on top of it in the DevOps space. But if you look at how that happened for enterprise, they were able to adopt that quite quickly, modernizing, breaking off some of their applications and modernizing those into that cloud native, so to speak, environment first and foremost. We use cloud native and Kubernetes centric almost synonymously, of course, because the Cloud Native Computing Foundation was really centered around Kubernetes. And when you look at how service providers have adopted that, of course, they didn't have the opportunity to easily break off chunks of their applications like enterprises did and start to modernize them right away, right? Service providers kind of coalesce around standards bodies and organizations that, talk together, figure out what we're going to do in the 3GPP space. What are we going to do for 5G? What are we going to do for our RAN initiatives, for these next generations of infrastructure? So they tend to be more on this cadence of, 3G, 4G, 5G, etc. And those present natural steps for them to modernize. And so with the rise of 5G and Kubernetes having already been on the scene, this was the natural next step for service providers, right? To move from virtualized to containerized, from things like virtual machine management systems that had been used to orchestrate the virtual network functions in the 4G era, to things like Kubernetes to manage the containerized network functions of the 5G era. And that transition is still very much going on. So they're straddling both worlds, as enterprises are too. Legacy doesn't ever just go away. But the other challenge that service providers face is they don't necessarily have client-server types of applications that are all endpoint microservices. As they're refactoring their network and their security functions, these things are often, of course, waypoint services, right? That are processing traffic for mobile subscribers, for broadband subscribers, and for business subscribers, to do all sorts of things. But because they're waypoint services, because they're also packet processing in many cases, they also have high performance, high availability, all sorts of additional requirements and a standard of excellence that they must meet in terms of scale, performance, and reliability that don't always need to be engineered into enterprise systems the same way.
No, sure. What is really interesting about this is that, the way they had control over the environment in the past seems to have gone, and they now have to take allowance of what's going on in the data center. And of course, we used to have these very centralized data centers, but now it's been dispersed and distributed out to the edge. And 5G, as you rightly say, is a major changer in that respect, because it's making the service providers, the telcos, think about not only the traditional endpoints, and as you said, they're getting services out to those endpoints, but the billions of endpoints that, many people like Juniper point out are evolving as we move into the worlds of IoT. So we've gone from connecting buildings and people now to the things and devices. And therefore, I think the point that comes clear from what you just said is that the traffic becomes really important. And in many ways, the telecom industry used to focus on its inner workings and not on what it actually delivers for its end customers, or in this case, its partners, because it's not just about the telcos themselves; it's about who sits within that ecosystem. And I think that is that how you see 5G really changing the vision from the service provider side? Yeah,
I would agree with all of that. I mean, I'd add also that with 5G and with this more multi-cloud era, enterprises moving to multi-cloud, I think people understand what the term implies. It implies hybrid cloud and the use of multiple clouds. Well, with service providers, this is all still true, certainly in the sense of their IT clouds. But in their sense of their telco clouds, there's a wider distribution of multiple compute clusters, right? They'll have much more of this spread out across many remote sites, many more, I guess you could say, geographically centralized or main sites. And some of these will be running on their own on-premises owned infrastructure, as well as some of the hyperscaler, cloud infrastructure. So there's hybrid sense in that sense of transformation of how things are working too.
Exactly. It's that ecosystem change, of course, as you rightly say, it's not just about the telcos, it's about partnering with, as those hyperscalers bring things towards the edge, as you, as a provider of infrastructure and services to them, bring services to the table. So the management of it and the management of all of these moving parts. And let's face it, as we have up to 100 billion moving parts in the future, or 100 billion connected things hitting the market, then we've just got to make sure this efficiency is there to deliver. I'd like to change direction a little bit. And you mentioned that you were involved, I think, in your introduction, both in the acquisition of Comtrail and indeed Apstra. So can we turn to Apstra? Juniper added Apstra to the portfolio of products. What problem does Apstra solve, and why is it important to the customers?
Good question, and happy to pivot to talk about some Juniper-centric stuff and tie it back to those introductory remarks. So to answer the question, quickly and simply, Apstra is a fabric management system over switching fabrics inside of the data center. That's sort of a generic description of it. Apstra kind of made its name, and the reason why it was very famous was the Apstra company, when it was founded in 2015, they drove a trend towards intent-based networking. And they also had a maniacal focus on usability across multiple vendors with a common experience. So the workflows are abstracted across different vendors. And the fact that they're providing this multi-vendor fabric management system for different vendors of switches, right? Whether it be Juniper, Cisco, Arista, and so on, under one operational umbrella for our users, our customers. That's really how they made their namesake. And that intent-based networking is really the term that points to this abstraction, this facilitation of these workflows to an intent-based level. So less prescriptive step-by-step, less oriented towards the actual configuration and CLI of the individual devices, right? The fleet of switches that it's managing. And it does this on a fabric by fabric basis. And you're right, I said I worked on the Apstra acquisition. One of the reasons why I had the opportunity to do that is because insofar as product managing Contrail, I said I mentioned I worked on that acquisition too. Contrail, when we first acquired it and when it started out its life in 2013, it was really focused on software-defined networking for virtual machine management orchestration systems, namely OpenStack. And we open sourced that. Juniper open sourced that product. It became very, very well-known and well-adopted in the OpenStack space as a software-defined networking solution. And as Kubernetes came on the scene, we introduced it for that as well. We looked at and dabbled in supporting, vSphere. But over time, as Contrail became a point of control in the data center for our customers, we realized that we wanted to, add in support for switching fabric automation and management. And so we built that as a company into Contrail. And what we realized over time was that we would be better off for our own internal endeavors, like from a standpoint of engineering, testing, code quality, and velocity, if we had broken that apart and didn't build it in Contrail. We also found that the switching management, even from a user's perspective, for our service providers and our enterprises, was best left outside of Contrail in a separate, uncoupled piece of software where these things can work better together but don't necessarily need to be integrated. There's an interesting point of contrast here to like Cisco Aci, for example. The way that Cisco has built Aci, their flagship piece of software for data center operations, they really do have everything under one roof in terms of managing multiple fabrics, OpenStack, Kubernetes, and whatnot. And we found that in taking that approach, it was a bridge too far for customers. And like I said, even internally, it's better to have separate solutions that the customers can choose based on their own merits, and have a company, that has these different pieces of software as products, but allows customers to use them without having to present this monolithic solution, right? Without having to force the customer to eat all of it. So with Apstra and Contrail, right, we deprecated all of the fabric management stuff in Contrail. We were looking how to rebuild that separately. And the acquisition of Apstra just dramatically accelerated that strategy, of course. And at the same time, we're able to do things like multi-vendor, which is something that Juniper's actually been pretty committed to in a lot of ways. So it was a really exciting acquisition to work on.
I bet it was. And I think you touched on several really important points there, which is that, from a vendor point of view, let's say perhaps in the more hardware-centric view of the world in the past, you of course tried to tie people in, and it was easier to tie people in. But actually, as we move into this more software-centric nature of the beast, shall we say, that actually bringing the right pieces into it and managing it, orchestrating it all together, and thinking about it from the point of view of the customer, whether that's an enterprise or a service provider or a data center provider, and actually allowing them to build on what they already have, and perhaps even their internal expertise. We spend a lot of time talking about the technologies and the different vendors in there, but of course the actual people that run these things within the organizations often will drive the way that it's evolved. So yeah, very, very important point to bring out, that whole point about the multi-vendor nature of it, and actually giving the customer the choice and actually managing these moving parts as we go forward. So Apstra manages the fabric, and Contrail manages the overlay and the virtual networking. I think you touched upon this already, but are they standalone products, or are they working together, or are they moving towards each other? How would you describe those two things moving together?
Yeah, so a great question and point of clarity there. Insofar as evolving Contrail, I talked a little bit about its history just so I could tee up the logic behind us acquiring Apstra. These products are today completely independent, in the sense that there's no dependency of one on the other. And in fact, there's no dependency of using these products, not just with each other, but also on the Juniper hardware, to reemphasize a point that you just made. When you look at what we've done to decouple these products, there's also reasons and areas where we have the opportunity to reintegrate them. And that actually is an interesting place to talk about for service providers and some of the use cases that it benefits to have these things integrated. But perhaps what I'll mention first is with Contrail, having deprecated the fabric management piece, one of the things I mentioned is that when we built Contrail from the get-go, Contrail Networking, we focused on OpenStack first. Well, when we were looking to rationalize Contrail and to optimize it, what we also knew around this time is that our enterprise customers and our service provider customers were on this transformative journey towards Kubernetes and cloud native, and that we needed a software-defined networking product that was Kubernetes first and OpenStack second, instead of the way that we had kind of developed Contrail was very OpenStack centric, so OpenStack first, so to speak, in terms of its use cases that it addressed, and Kubernetes second. So we flipped that on its head, and we spent the last 18 months at Juniper redeveloping Contrail from the ground up in terms of its control plane to be all Kubernetes native. So one of the exciting things about this is we've gotten deep into Kubernetes, and we've made Contrail so much more accessible in doing this too. One of the challenges that our Contrail users have always had is that if you are looking to use it for OpenStack, you needed to have your own hardware. OpenStack is an infrastructure as a service system. Whereas Kubernetes, you can run it on your laptop like Minikube. You can run it on the public cloud where you have, on-demand, elastic, and disposable infrastructure. And so now you have the ability to run Contrail with Kubernetes, and you have the ease of deploying it on your laptop or on the public cloud. Obviously, you can deploy it on bare metal too. But we've rebuilt Contrail as an extension of Kubernetes. We're getting ready to release that version. It's version 22.1, short for 2022, first quarter. That's how our versioning works. And yeah, so we've been on this really exciting journey with Contrail and completely revamped it at the same time as when we did this Apstra acquisition. So we're now set up for a really exciting future where we've got a fabulously modern, lightweight, purpose-built Contrail for Kubernetes networking. They still support OpenStack networking, of course, by the way. And we've got Apstra, which is, just killing it in terms of winning business right now for Juniper switching and for Juniper Fabric operations, because of the things I talked about, the fact that it's really easy, it's intent-driven, it's multi-vendor. So, certainly our customers often do have switches from other vendors. The ability to have one point of control and one piece of software that they can train on and learn for those different switching fabrics is very exciting to them and unique in the industry. And then, to close the loop and come all the way back to your question about how are Apstra and Contrail evolving together in a sense. Well, for service providers, one of the things that they're doing in their Kubernetes clusters is they've also got workloads that need SRIOV, that's single root IO virtualization, high performance networking needs, which means that they cannot use the Contrail vRouter, which is our forwarding plane. They effectively bypass it in favor of additional performance out of their network interface card. And when they do that, the virtual network of that server, of course, needs to be plumbed into the switching fabric, right? Just like a bare metal server would. If you have a bare metal server and it's got some workload on it, and it needs to take part in the same virtual networks as all of your containers and your virtual machines that Contrail is networking, well, Apstra is really the system that manages those virtual networks in the switching fabric. And so it's also doing that for the SRIOV connected workloads, whether they're virtual machines or whether they're containers, for example. And this is a natural point of integration between Contrail and Apstra to effectively manage the overlay networks that are in the switching fabric, or EVPN, VXLAN overlays, with the Contrail managed overlays in the world of a Kubernetes cluster.
And it's great, the whole environment, especially if we move it to a service provider perspective, those flows and we talk about slices in the 5G world where we're dedicating infrastructure to particular tasks. But actually all of this, both the Contrail and Apstra, then also needs to feed up into the other systems, into my favorite area of BSS, OSS, ITMS, and then of course DevOps in that changing environment. How are you seeing your customers look at that and effectively bringing everything we've talked about together to deliver this more powerful, what we talked at the very top, this cloud automation, the power of cloud automation?
Yeah, that's a really exciting topic too. When you talk about higher order automation systems like those B/OSS systems, when you talk about DevOps and the need for higher order automation, you start to put together the picture of the full stack, right? You refer to it as like underlay and overlay of like Apstra managing the switching fabric, and it's the fabric automation insofar as the hardware switching fabric, and then Contrail managing the workload orchestration system on top. But of course, there's all of these higher order operational tools for service providers and enterprises atop of that. And you mentioned DevOps. One of the interesting trends that both enterprises and service providers are also getting pulled into, I would say more on the service provider front, but led by enterprise in the same way that enterprises led the Kubernetes adoption and service providers kind of saw all of the transition from OpenStack to Kubernetes, from virtualized to containerized. The service providers are also seeing this transition in the enterprise from server administration and more manual-based administration to automated operations and DevOps. And with that, one of the most enabling technology underpinnings, I guess you could say, for DevOps is infrastructure as code. And Kubernetes lends itself very well to doing this. What we've been focused on with Apstra and Contrail is that when you're actually automating your switching fabric, or when you're automating your networking for your Kubernetes cluster, that you also have the ability to take these software-defined networking systems and drive them as code, right? Because they are software-defined infrastructure. And if you've got some other infrastructure like your servers or your Kubernetes cluster itself, and you're setting that up and you're setting up your applications as code, then you want to do that in sync with all of your infrastructure as well. And of course, that gets into the benefits of all of the site reliability engineering, the SRE benefits that accrue from infrastructure as code. So what this means in simple terms is that things like Apstra and things like Contrail, they are intent driven, they are declarative in their configuration, and they do lend themselves very well to infrastructure as code. In fact, with Contrail being refactored to be Kubernetes native, because Kubernetes is often consumed through the kubectl in its first forms of people getting used to it, and then configured all through code, we actually have this adjacent product called Contrail Pipelines. I shouldn't really call it a product. It's a feature add-on of Contrail networking that allows it to be driven completely through a continuous integration, continuous deployment, a CI/CD pipeline, and totally as code. So yes, Juniper is absolutely doing things in this space. We're absolutely integrating through the product APIs with higher order systems, whether those things are chat ops systems, incident management sorts of systems to reference your ITSM systems, and working with system integrators and OSS, BSS vendors to build the integration between our network automation systems and their wider purview of automating the entire 5G solution, let's say, for a service provider.
James, I think that is a great way to draw together the little journey that we've just been on from what this cloud automation is, looking at Apstra and Contrail, and then how 5G is changing it, and bringing it together under that story of how we need to be thinking more about the way code is driven and the way we develop things, and not be obsessed with some of the former, if you like, compartmentalization of different technology. So James, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on Get Connected. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Chris.
So there you have it, listener. The vast experience that James brings to the table from working across engineering and in different areas within the Juniper environment, helping the acquisition of Apstra and Contrail, but most importantly, bringing the story together, how the service provider environment is changing to bring together the benefits of automation at all those levels, from the underlying fabric, the underlay, to the overlay, and then upwards and outwards into the operational systems environments, the BSS environments, and of course that new area of DevOps, which is helping us shape the future of the service provider industry. Now, all that remains is a few thank yous. Thank you to Juniper for the opportunity to dig into this subject of power cloud automation. And thank you to you too for listening. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
You've been listening to Get Connected. You've heard from us, now we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think via Twitter using the handle @Juniper Networks. And if you like what you've heard, remember to tell your colleagues and friends. Thanks for listening to Get Connected.